what I really want to talk about was kind of give a big picture thing on this oral fluid testing, where I think it could go, what kind of opportunities it offers me, or us. And I was struck by what Jim Cleavenside said this morning: disease management may be the key to survival. Disease management may be the key to survival. Well, disease management, you've got to have data. We can't be guessing, and we can't be doing too many autopsies or necropsies on too many dead pigs. It's too late by then. Disease management implies that we're ahead of the curve. So that's kind of where I see us going. What is it going to take us to get us a little bit ahead of the curve? So big picture kind of thing. And I'm going to kind of use some comments that Bob Morrison made at a talk last year to kind of push off on. Real smart guy. It never hurts to follow a smart guy, so I'm just going to use his comments as a bridge to my comments. So Bob says disease control needs epidemiologic intelligence. In my lingo, that means we need field data, again, for these disease management issues. We need data for issues. And I'd put in not only for disease control, but also for production management. We have to be able to be in the position of understanding enough about what's going on in terms of pig health to make predictions. We need expectations. We have to drive the future as well. We have had a few comments on our changing industry and what that means for disease control. We have some examples from the human side. We don't have very much on the animal side, but we have some examples on the human side about predicting outbreaks, particularly in the context of population size. So here's a case, given the same virus, what happens when you increase population size? And here we have same virus. This happens to be measles virus in populations of greater and greater size. And basically what happens as you get bigger and bigger is you lose the capacity to achieve herd immunity. That's one important thing. Down here, between these outbreaks, we have complete herd immunity, and these outbreaks are the result of new introductions. At the other extreme up here, we never achieve herd immunity, and we have instead these continual outbreaks between the acute outbreaks. The other thing you see is you increase population size, you see shorter periods between these big outbreaks. And you see larger outbreaks that just become regular, highly regular. And you've probably all seen data on sow herds. You get around to about 25% prevalence for PRRS, and boom, there we go. And it's just this wave that goes on and on into the future. In this case, the wave stopped through control measures. And this is exactly the same thing that's happening in our industry. This is the kind of stuff that Jim talked about earlier. When you compare the USDA numbers, clinical outbreaks, the more you get closer you get to 2006, the more regular, the more frequent you see disease outbreaks. We're up at the top of the graph here. Predicting performance. This is an experiment that we did a few years ago. Actually, this is an experiment from which we did the first oral fluid sampling. March 2005, did the first oral fluid sampling on this group of pigs. We've been doing tonsil scrapings, and I don't know if you ever scraped pig tonsils. Once isn't too bad. You can maybe even get away with twice. The third time you walk into that pen with that spoon, those pigs are climbing the walls. And so these guys got so big we just couldn't handle them. But I knew they were still excreting virus, and so we tried ropes. It worked. But the other thing you see in terms of productivity is, here's the negative controls. These are age-matched. Actually, these 150-some pigs all came from 17 litters. They were age-matched. They were all fed the same day. These guys, nice and uniform little cookie-cutter pigs. And here's our PRRS pigs. These are 21 days in, and you can see these little hairy guys, some big guys. The non-uniformity, just classic for PRRS, right? And so when you graph it up, we were talking earlier about compensatory and non-compensatory growth. Here you see non-compensatory. Here's our PRRS positive pigs. They're finishing out 2 weeks later and much more uneven than our negative controls. Well, if we have our our disease management data so we can, in fact, monitor and make these kind of predictions based on the historical data. We're going to be way ahead of the curve. We're going to know when these guys are going to finish and how they're going to finish. So Bob poses as a question, does our industry need better infrastructure to address current and future disease challenges? And Scott kind of talked about that a little bit. We need to cooperate a little bit better if we're going to achieve regional control for PRRS. We do need some kind of infrastructure. Jim talked a little bit about the fact that if you look at this weaned finished stuff, we've seen these increases. This is a piece that came out of the National Hog Farmer in 2006, 0.2% increase per year between 1996 and 2005, not linked to PCV2. And it's a global trend. And there's this concurrent increase in health costs. We can't really continue to not deal with this kind of stuff, but again, you need data to do that. And then kind of back to Scott's thing a little bit, we're a very big and complex industry. Our current infrastructure probably isn't doing that well. This is a graph of pig movement in 2006 that Spencer Weaned put together. This is a presentation made in 2007 at the International PRRS Symposium. This is pretty tough to control disease when we have this kind of movement. We need better data. So is the current infrastructure working? And I don't want to bring up H1N1 because it drives me nuts. But this kind of stuff, where somebody that doesn't represent us is on the podium, right, and we see these kind of images, and we hear this, attention, we interrupt this emergency breaking news bulletin with an even scarier emergency breaking bulletin. Don't get me started. We definitely need data so that we can be at the podium talking about stuff. But one of the realities of the current situation is NIH got $10 billion in the stimulus package for new research, and animal health got a goose egg. Whatever happens, we are going to be the ones that drive the whole process. And so we need producer-driven, cheap, efficient collection of data. It's going to be up to us, and it's been up to our colleagues in the veterinary profession to take charge. Nobody's going to come in and do it for us. So I just really think that if we had somebody from our side presenting real data, the whole way that this recent debacle with H1N1 unfolded would have been much different. I think that we could have avoided or prevented some of the dollar losses, as well as done a much better job at preserving our image. So big picture conclusions is we need data to drive these disease management decisions. We need data to control disease, to optimize our productivity, to protect our industry, but it's got to be cheap. We need a lot of data, and it needs to be current data. We don't need retrospective data. We need current data from which we can base predictions. So John touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to emphasize the fact that this is really not a revolutionary approach. This is an approach that's been used very successfully on the human side for quite a while. John made a reference to the fact that the first oral fluid testing in humans was 1909. That's 100 years ago. So it's probably about time for us to pick up those reins and see if we can apply it to our industry as well. But I want to just kind of emphasize some of the field applications we've seen on the human side, just to show that we can do some big things with this approach. 1988, Rational Program for Screening Travelers for Antibodies to Hepatitis A. 1992, Comparison of Saliva and Serum for HIV Surveillance in Developing Countries. 1994, HIV Surveillance by testing saliva from injecting drug users. 1994, use of oral fluid for Hepatitis C screening. We're starting to see the fact that in the human side it's applied for not just HIV, but here we see Hepatitis A, Hepatitis C. Here we see measles. 1997, surveillance of measles in England and Wales, National Saliva Testing Program. 2001 has oral fluid the potential to replace serum for the evaluation of population immunity levels. a study of measles, rubella, and hepatitis B. Very common theme. You see this application in Africa or other places where there's not the resources to do the blood sampling, basically. If you do this kind of thing, you don't need refrigeration, you don't need needles, you don't need highly trained people. Not to even mention the fact that the people that may run at the site of a bare needle are very willing to give an oral fluid sample. A few more applications. 2004, a population-based seroprevalence study of hepatitis A using oral fluid in England and Wales. This was a mail-in survey. So basically, stick the sampler in your mouth, put it in the envelope, mail it in. Pretty cheap. 2007, participant collected mail-delivered for hepatitis A. Another one, 2009, mailed-in samples received from 11,700 children. It's a case where the moms were collecting these samples from kids at home. Can't hardly get much simpler. I love simple. A little bit in terms of performance on the human side, they've had some fairly good assays, but they've had the time to develop them. Probably the cornerstone publication was the 1986 publication from Archibald, detailing the fact that there were antibodies, anti-HIV antibodies in people infected with HIV. Within 8 years, they'd had the initial test developed, and here by 2004, they had much better, much faster tests with 99.8% specificity, 99% sensitivity. So between March 2005 and May 2008, they'd run almost 170,000 oral fluid samples in these 10 STD clinics in New York. A 0.27% false positive rate. Pretty doggone good. In this case, since it's a fast test, they test on the spot. If you screen positive, they collect serum and they run a Western blot, so they can confirm very quickly. This is a little picture showing this little device that they use. Here's the OraQuick Advanced Rapid HIV1 and HIV2 antibody test. So from the human side, you see there's a whole ton of research on oral fluid diagnostics, beginning as early as 1909. Their focus has been primarily on antibody detection. We got involved mostly in PCRs, just because the PCR technology was online about that time. They'd started before PCRs were really available. Very widely used in surveillance, especially HIV, but you can also see lots of mail-in surveys for other assays. I have to emphasize they've had the time to develop these assays for oral fluids. We need the little time as well. That's basically what's in process right now. But there's every reason to think that we can be successful. I want to talk a little bit about the field applications we've done so far looking at this technology. So here's a summary of, this is all PCR field data. It's important to remember, to recognize that the PCR data is really talking about excretion of whatever pathogen we're looking for. It doesn't necessarily say that afterwards if we had antibody tests, what I'm trying to say is if we had antibody tests, we'd be finding these positives further out. So we're really only detecting that acute phase of virus excretion, right, rather than just an antibody test. So 10 sites, 6 pens per site, for a total of 600 samples. These are typically 1,100 head weaned to finish barns. We went in, and actually I should say John went in. This is really a study that John and Pat Hoffman carried off. In every case, it's the same 6 pens that were sampled over time at 2-week intervals. So samples were collected by site personnel. John and Pat made up posters, fairly large posters, so site personnel would know exactly what the protocol was. Where to put the ropes, how to collect the ropes, how long to leave the ropes in there, where to mail them to. They had coolers, they had the whole thing right there. So they had all the supplies on the site, and the site personnel were trained or saw the process one time. After that, they did everything. And there was only one set of samples from one barn that came in a week late. Everything else came in right on time. So just to kind of get you started, here's a summary of the field data, 10 sites, 6 pens per site. This is a summary for SIV, for PCV2, and for PERS. The bars indicate the percent of pens that tested PCR positive for any one of these three agents. So here's 100%. So we got something here just over 20% positive on this particular day zero sample for SIV, and so on and so forth. The lines indicate the quantitative PCR values. So here's this value would be about 4 logs of SIV. That's the mean value of these pens that tested positive on that day. I do think it's kind of interesting that you see this interesting PCV2 response. Out here, the pigs came in at 3 weeks of age, so they'd be 5 weeks of age, 7 weeks of age is when they start this slow rise in terms of quantitative PCRs. I think it's very interesting. And here's the PERS values. One of the things that this study made us able to do is you can start looking at these different patterns of shedding, and then you can also start putting it into context. So in this particular site, these guys were seeing PERS, or shedding PERS, at the same time they were shedding SIV. So the clinical presentation would probably be different, and of course PCV2. So the clinical presentation under this circumstance is probably different than for this particular herd, for example, that was pretty much free and clear of SIV, dealing with PCV2, and that's about it for that particular point in time. What I'm trying to say is this combination of concurrent infections has got to be important for us. We don't really know very much about how to interpret it. We have research studies that were done that are very limited. But here we have a case of something in the neighborhood of 10,000 pigs that have seen various combinations of diseases, which is going to give us eventually much more power to figure out what's important and what's not important. Which timing is important? Does it matter if one comes first, or if virus B comes first, or C, or whatever? Well, this data is complex, but I'm going to try to show you what we've seen in here. Here's the week in the barn. So these pigs came in at 3 weeks of age. Here's pig age, 3 weeks. Here's our 10 barns, barn 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on and so forth. These are actually different sites. They're scattered across the Midwest, one barn per site. And then here's our 6 pens. And what we're going to show over time is what happens in pen 1, for example, barn 1, pen 1. Our color scheme is, the colors are a little bit muddy here, but this is PCV2. It's supposed to be a yellow. It kind of ended up being I don't know what to call that. So here's PCV2 only. Here's PCV2 plus PERS, kind of this more orangey thing. You can see here's a little more orangey there. So this is PCV2, and here's one of these pens in barn 1 that had PCV2 and PERS at the same time. And so on and so forth. Here's SIV only. Here's SIV plus PERS. Purple is only PERS. Green is PCV2 plus SIV. You can see it's kind of a complex mix. Hard to present this much data. For sure black is bad, because black means you've got PCV2, SIV, and PERS all at the same time. So barn 3 is the bad boy in this study. So we can let this unfold over time. Let me just scroll down here a little bit. So again, here's barn 3, the bad boy, and you can see what happened in this same pen tested over time. This is kind of an interesting combination here, because we see all 3 pathogens circulating for so long here. So now we're at the 14 weeks, and you can start seeing things develop further. All these animals were vaccinated against PCV2. 2 different vaccines were used, and several different protocols. And you can see a difference here in how things actually came out. We've got the data, we haven't done the analysis, so I can't tell you which protocols were used for PCV2, but for sure, whatever they're doing in barns 8 and 9 is what I want to do in my system. Because these guys, we see much less PCV2 in these guys than we do in the most of the rest of them. And whatever they're doing in barn 3, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Because you can see they've got everything happening here. And not only that, I think it's so interesting, we're detecting PERS out here to 14 weeks in 1 or more pens, with this one exception. PRRS is just cranking through this thing week after week after week. And then about the time you think they're done, then you get another SIV outbreak. So barn 3 is just tough. We have 2 other pathogens we're actually testing for. There's been a report of a new Ph.D. virus. That'd be a relative of classical swine fever virus or DVD virus. We're testing for that one at Roman Pogornichny at Purdue University is doing that testing. He's also in the process of testing for TTV virus, or TTV, excuse me. That's in progress. TTV kind of came up in the last year or so as a potential problem for us. Among the 600 samples that we have to test, he's done 121 so far. 25 of these 121 were positive for TTV1. There's 2 genotypes, TTV1 and TTV2. 97 of 121 were positive for TTV2. And of these 25 that were positive for TTV1, 23 were also positive for TTV2. So we'll see where those all lay out, but that testing's in progress. Well, for me, there's some things. There's a lot of data here. We're in the process of tearing apart, but there's some things I think that are pretty obvious. One thing is impossible to reproduce this study or the interaction we see here under any experimental conditions. And we had, one of the things the researchers have been trying to do is understand how these things all interact. Well, here's our laboratory. And not only can we reproduce all these different interactions, but there's no way in the world that anybody's going to be able to afford 10,000 pigs like we have here. The price tag is a little bit higher than I'd like on this. Between the 5 pathogens, and that's the Ph.D. virus, TTV, PCV2, SIV, and PRRS, we spent $10,000 a flow. So this is a $100,000 study. It's too high for us. We need to get that down to $1,000 for commercial application. So we could do that by maybe sampling less frequently, maybe a sample every 4 weeks, or if we can get these antibody assays up. Because you can see, for example, with the PRRS IgM assay, you start picking up IgM within 3 or 4 days. That's nearly as good as PCR. And if IgM indicates acute infection like we think it does, then we could get our cost down to, instead of $25 a sample, we get it down to $5 a sample. So that cuts our price by 80%. So then we're starting to get into something that's really, really possible. The other thing I think it's important is the stuff we're seeing here is just not in the literature. This is really unique stuff. Maybe it's because our industry has changed. If you think how different things are now than they were 20 years ago, everything's changed. If you think of those curves, we're really up toward the top curve much more. So the stuff's not in the books. We really have to do our own field research if we're going to be in control of this stuff. I was surprised to see how busy these pigs were, even at 3 weeks of age. They're weaned. They come from the farrowing house into the system, and they're already busy. They're already dealing with the adversities of life. I was also surprised. All these sites they came from 5 sow farms, all in the same system. So I was surprised at how different these patterns are across these 10. Just these 10. It'd be interesting to see 100 or 1,000 of these flows. Also surprised to see how variable the duration of PCV2 shedding was, PRRS and SIV, because you do see these guys where you'll see just one acute outbreak of SIV, boom, all done. Or here's a more typical, what I think of as a more typical PRRS pattern. We get 3 positive samples there, and then boom, we're all clean. But then you see these like the bad barn 3, where you just see this stuff cranking chronically through there. So there's much more variability than I would have expected. And you also see these repeat episodes where, again, going back to barn 3, you have this prolonged SIV outbreak, and then at the end you see the SIV again. So you see this both for PRRS and SIV. And I was surprised to see how much PCV2 was excreted in oral fluids over time. Hadn't expected that. I learned a lot from this one. And it's pretty obvious that some PCV2 vaccination protocols work a whole lot better than others. So in terms of achieving our goals, I think this data I should mention this economic analysis, the productivity effects, We do have morbidity and mortality data. We have treatment data for each one of these sampling periods. We need to put that together with this data and see what that tells us. Potential applications, it's going to be up to you guys, but it sure seems like a pretty good way to monitor negative status populations. So when Scott D talks about cooperation, collaboration on these regional projects, this would certainly be a fairly painless way for us to have herd monitor themselves, because site personnel can make the collections, send them into the central testing spot, so we could keep track of what people were doing in terms of their negative status. Looks like a pretty good way to evaluate vaccine protocols and vaccine efficacy, looking at here Barnes 8 and 9. Could be a very good way of monitoring vaccine compliance, controlled exposure, particularly by PCR, but possibly by antibodies as well. Pretty good way of monitoring antibiotic withdrawal. Virtually anything that's in serum shows up in oral fluids. They've done some early work. If you inject fluorescein dye, within a matter of seconds or minutes, you detect it in oral fluids. So we should be able to actually look at antibiotics over time. And of course, here's kind of where my interest is at: predicting disease losses, predicting growth rates and uniformity, and then planning, timing, and testing different interventions. I kind of wish Dale was here. We struggled. One of the questions we haven't answered is, we did 6 pens. We did it every 2 weeks. Was that too many pens? Was that not enough pens? Was 2 weeks too often or not often enough? These things we don't really know yet because we're still working through the process. But I did pick up one of these papers that Dale Polson had put together. I think this was for IPVS 2002. But the point here was that, excuse me, the point here is that given the fact that you're going to collect 240 samples from a herd over a year's point in time, that's what's on your budget, 240 samples, you are much better off in terms of detection. You're much better off testing more frequently, even if you test fewer samples, which kind of fits in with the approach we're taking on this relatively small number of samples, 6 samples, not much, but testing more frequently. I'd mention one other thing, and some people, for good or for ill, say, well, you're pooling samples and we don't like pooling samples, or we do like pooling samples and that's good you're pooling samples. I don't think pen samples are pooled samples because they're so highly correlated. It's more like when you go in and do a study on a family, the people in a family are most likely to be the same, whatever it is you're testing for. In this case, these pigs are living cheek to jowl, and it's most likely they're going to be the same status. What I hate to see is if you collect 6 samples from 6 different buildings and mix them, you're more likely to test or dilute away from whatever you're trying to find out. So these are it's a highly correlated sample. It's not really a pooled sample. At least that's the way I kind of look at that. So what's coming up? And I think there's important things, and John mentioned some of this. There's quite a number of places that are working pretty hard at optimization. We talked about how important test optimization is. It's a new sample. It's different than serum. It has its own characteristics. Kansas State is working with Susan Wong, who's in New York, on PCV2, and I should have put PERS as well. They're using the Luminex assay. Iowa State is looking at SIV in particular, but also John mentioned the PCV2 stuff, and Aaron Straight's working on MHIO. South Dakota has a couple different proposals in looking at both antigen capture using oral fluids as well as other antibody assays. PCR optimization, we learned a lot from the stuff we did last year, just about how insensitive PCR could be if you assume that the protocol that was optimized for serum would work for oral fluid. That's not the case. So PCR optimization is an ongoing process. And then oral fluid sampling from sows and boars is something that we identified as research in progress. I already played my videos, so you saw those. But I think it's important. I'm going to give it a shot. I can't help it. I think the possibility of being able to monitor boars and sows individual boards and sows, it's huge, opens up all kinds of new stuff, whether it's from the point of view of disease monitoring or the point of view of public perception, making us a more user-friendly or consumer-friendly industry. I think that's a very important issue. This study that the PIC is doing, they've had 3 replicates, 24 boars in each replicate. In each replicate, they've used a different virus inoculum. So we're going to find out if we can in fact have the same kind of performance in these adults that we've seen in weaned to finish animals. Proof's in the pudding, and we're going to find out. And we're going to have, working with South Dakota, working with Mike Murtaugh in Minnesota, working with Bob Rowland in Kansas State, we're going to take these individual samples and see how they perform on the tests. And so that's going to be pretty exciting. So to kind of wrap it up, we know we can do surveillance of commercial swine units using oral fluid samples. It's a pretty simple process to collect these samples. We know that the PCRs work pretty well. We can probably improve them, but we've learned a lot doing what we've done. We know that in terms of a concept, the antibody assays can be made to work, and we think that we can improve further upon those. So there's lots of stuff that has been pretty positive so far. If you break it all down, the pros, I think, it's a lower cost sample than serum to collect. It's lower tech than serum. I always like simple. For me, nothing like a simple valve or a toggle switch. I'm not much into computer chips. I tend to break them. We think we can probably use lower sample numbers than serum. And we've got some tests now, and we're going to have, we think we'll have new tests available, new optimized assays available by the end of next summer. The cons, this barn or site level testing is going to require a paradigm shift on our part, because really in that case the unit you're looking at is not the pig, it's the barn. What is the health of the barn? So we have to change kind of the way we assess things. It's not going to be the individual pig. How healthy is the barn or the site? The cons of the PCRs are too expensive right now, and if I were in the place of having to make management decisions now, probably what I would do is I would start testing the thing. I'd ask my people what they thought of it. I'd try it a few times, and I'd get ready. Well, I'd probably reserve judgment, but I'd think about what would happen if these new tests become available. I think it's something to start become familiar with. I probably wouldn't go whole hog until I get some cheaper tests. We got a lot of things to learn on this, and of course it's a new thing, so it's going to be not that easy. As John mentioned, there's just lots of people that have been involved in this project or these projects, and so I want to acknowledge all of the people that have helped so far.